The first thing Caleb Moore learned in life was that nobody was coming to save him. He learned it at age 4, sitting on a plastic chair in a county office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, wearing shoes 2 sizes too small, holding a garbage bag that had everything he owned inside it, a broken crayon, a stuffed dog with one eye missing, and a picture of a woman he barely remembered. A woman with dark hair and tired eyes who used to hum while she washed dishes. A woman who one morning simply did not come back. Nobody explained it to him. Nobody sat down and said, "Caleb, your mother is gone and we don't know where she went." They just moved him from the chair to a car, from the car to a house, from the house to another house, and then another, and then another. 7 foster homes in 11 years. 7 different beds. 7 different sets of rules. 7 different ways of being reminded that he was temporary. He learned to pack fast. He learned to eat whatever was put in front of him without complaining. He learned to be invisible, small and quiet, and useful enough to keep around, but never loud enough to make anyone feel like they had to love him. Because love, in Caleb's experience, was a thing people said before they sent you away. By the time he was 15, he had stopped waiting for someone to come back. By the time he was 18, he had a high school diploma he earned by staying up past midnight in borrowed bedrooms, a Social Security card, $47 in cash, and absolutely nothing else. The foster system handed him a pamphlet about transitional housing, shook his hand, and closed the door. He stood on the sidewalk outside the county building, holding that pamphlet, and he made a decision that would change everything. Not because it was a bold decision, not because it was a dramatic one, but because it was the only decision left. He decided he was going to survive. Not just survive. He was going to build something from nothing, the way you build a fire in the rain, slowly, carefully, protecting the smallest flame with everything you have. He found a room in a boarding house on the east side of Chicago for $210 a month. He found a job washing dishes at a diner called Rosie's on West Madison. He found a library card, and he used it like a weapon, reading everything, absorbing everything, learning the language of a world that had never bothered to speak to him directly. For 3 years, Caleb Moore did nothing remarkable. He washed dishes. He mopped floors. He saved money in a jar under his bed. He took 2 online classes at a time through a community college, paying for each one with cash he saved from tips when the regular waiter called in sick and the manager let him cover the floor. He learned that he was good with people, not in the way that came from confidence, but in the way that came from years of reading rooms, watching faces, figuring out what someone needed before they said it out loud. That skill, the quiet skill of understanding people without being asked, would eventually change his life. But first it would cost him everything. Before we go any further, if the story is already pulling at something in your chest, if you already feel something for this young man standing on that sidewalk with $47 in a pamphlet, please hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with someone who loves a story that makes them feel something real. And drop a comment below. Tell us your name. Tell us you're here. Because this story is for you, and we want to know you're watching. Now, let's go back to Caleb. The morning that changed everything started like every other morning. Caleb woke up at 5:15. He did not use an alarm because he had not slept past 5:30 in 4 years. His body had been trained by necessity into a kind of permanent readiness, as if some part of him was always waiting for the next thing to go wrong. He made coffee in a small pot on the hot plate in his room. He ironed his one good dress shirt, white, with a small stain near the second button that he had learned to angle away from view. He combed his hair. He looked at himself in the small mirror above the sink. He was 21 years old. He had the kind of face that was hard to place. Not young enough to be dismissed, not old enough to be taken seriously, with dark eyes that had a quality to them that made people feel, without knowing why, that he had seen more than someone his age should have seen. His hands were the hands of someone who had worked since childhood, callous, careful, steady. He took a bus across town to an address on Michigan Avenue. The building was called Hargrove Tower. 62 floors of glass and steel that caught the morning light and threw it back at the street in blinding pieces. Caleb had passed this building 100 times and never once looked up at it the way most people did, with their mouths slightly open, feeling small. He just noted it, filed it away, the way you filed away anything that was not yet relevant. But today it was relevant, because today, Hargrove Tower was hosting what the listing called an exclusive recruitment event for food and beverage service staff for something called the Hargrove Grand, a private members' dining room on the 51st floor that catered exclusively to client of Hargrove Capital, one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. Caleb had found a listing at 11:15 at night on a Tuesday, and he had applied at 11:16. He was not naive about his chances. He knew what exclusive meant in this city. He knew what it meant in every city. It meant that the person reading his application would look at his address, a boarding house on the east side, and feel something shift in their expression before they even finished reading his name. It meant that the lack of a college degree, the lack of references beyond a diner manager and a landlord, the lack of anything on paper that said, this person belongs in a room like this, would do most of the work before he ever opened his mouth. But Caleb had learned something in 21 years that most people spend a lifetime trying to understand. He had learned that the door that was hardest to walk through was usually the door worth walking through. He walked into the lobby of Hargrove Tower at 7:58 in the morning. The lobby alone was the size of Rosie's Diner 3 times over. Marble floors the color of cream. Ceiling so high that the security desk at the center of the room looked like a small island in a very large sea. 2 women in blazers stood near a sign-in table by the elevators, holding clipboards, their expressions a kind of carefully arranged pleasantness that cost a person something to maintain all day. There were 17 other applicants in the lobby. Caleb counted them automatically, a habit, not a choice. Most of them were in their late 20s or 30s. Most of them had the ease that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. They stood with their weight evenly distributed. They spoke to each other with a casual familiarity of people who had worked rooms like this before. Caleb stood near the window and waited. His name was called Ninth. He was escorted to a conference room on the 4th floor by a young woman named Patricia, who did not make eye contact and spoke in a clipped, efficient tone of someone running slightly behind schedule. The conference room had a glass table, 6 chairs, and a view of an alley. Seated at the table were 2 people, a man in his 50s named Gerald, who was a director of food and beverage operations, and a woman in her 40s named Sandra, who managed the floor staff. The interview lasted 22 minutes. Caleb answered every question directly. He did not inflate. He did not apologize for what he didn't have. When Gerald asked why someone with his background would apply for a position at this level, Caleb looked at him steadily and said something that made Sandra stop writing on her notepad. He said, "Because I have been reading people my whole life, and I am very good at it. And this room is full of people who need to be read correctly." Gerald studied him for a long moment. Then he said they would be in touch. 3 days later, Patricia called. Caleb had been selected for a 2-week trial period. The position paid $19 an hour plus a share of the service charge, which, given the caliber of clients, was not insignificant. There was a uniform. There was training. There was a list of rules longer than any contract Caleb had ever seen, covering everything from the proper way to present a menu to what to do if a client spilled wine on another client's spouse. Caleb read every word of it. Twice. He started on a Monday. The Hargrove Grand was not a restaurant. Caleb understood that within the first hour. It was a performance. A very expensive, very controlled performance in which every element, the lighting, the temperature, the weight of the silverware, the exact degree to which a glass was filled, was calibrated to communicate one thing to the people sitting at those tables. That thing was, you matter. You matter more than ordinary things. You are in a room that was built specifically around the idea of you. Caleb had never eaten in a room like this. He had never, in fact, eaten in any room that was designed with him in mind. But he understood the performance immediately. The way someone who has never played piano but has listened to it their whole life can hear when a note is wrong. He moved through the room carefully that first week. He learned the names of the regular clients. There were 41 of them who came with any frequency, and he had them all memorized by Wednesday. He learned their preferences without being told, the way he always had. Mr. Edelman always wanted his water with no ice, even though he never said so, because he held the glass near the bottom and the cold bothered his fingers. Mrs. Castellano always ordered the salmon, but always looked at the steak. So Caleb began placing the bread basket slightly closer to her side of the table, because it gave her something to do with her hands while she talked herself out of what she actually wanted. Sandra noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. Gerald noticed too. He began scheduling Caleb for the floor shifts that covered the private dining room at the back, the room within the room, reserved for the highest tier clients, the ones who did not want to be seen even by the other people who paid not be seen. It was in that private room, on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of November, that Caleb Moore first saw Dominic Hargrove. Dominic Hargrove was not what Caleb expected. He had seen photographs, of course. The building was named after the man. His face appeared in the lobby in a subtle, tasteful way. Not a portrait, nothing so obvious, but a black and white photograph in a frame near the elevator bank. The kind of thing you might almost miss if you weren't paying attention. In the photograph, Dominic Hargrove was younger, maybe mid-40s, standing on a dock somewhere with the kind of squinting, unposed expression of someone who had been photographed by surprise and hadn't performed for it. He had a strong face, silver hair even then, the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that the weight had become invisible. The man who walked into the private dining room that Thursday was 63 years old. He was tall, taller than Caleb expected, which was not usually the way it went with powerful men who had been built up in your imagination before you met them. He wore a charcoal suit that had not been bought off a rack. He walked the way people walk when they stop thinking about how they walk, with absolute, unconsidered authority, the way a ship moves through water, not pushing against it, but simply occupying the space it passes through. He was alone. That was the first thing Caleb noticed that was wrong. In 3 weeks of working the private room, he had never seen anyone at that level come in alone. These people traveled in formations, assistants, partners, wives, or husbands, or lawyers. The way important people travel, surrounded by the evidence of their importance. But Dominic Hargrove walked in alone, sat down at the corner table without being shown to it, and placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. He did not look at a menu. He did not look at his phone. He stared at the middle distance and appeared to be thinking about something so far away that the room around him had temporarily ceased to exist. Caleb approached the table with the quiet efficiency he had learned to make invisible. He set down the water glass. He moved to place the menu. Dominic Hargrove's eyes moved to his face with an abruptness that was unsettling. Not aggressive, not unkind, but sudden, like a light turning on in a dark room. He said, "What's your name?" Caleb said, "Caleb, sir." Dominic studied him for 3 full seconds. Not the way someone studies a new employee. The way someone studies something they think they might recognize. Then he said, "Bring me whatever the kitchen thinks is good today. I don't want to read anything." Caleb said, "Yes, sir." He walked back toward the kitchen, and he did not look back, but the skin along the back of his neck did something it had not done in a very long time. Something that felt uncomfortably like being watched by someone who was seeing more than you meant to show. Dominic Hargrove came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He always sat at the corner table. He always came alone. He always asked for Caleb by name after the second visit. Sandra told Caleb this with a slight elevation of her eyebrows that communicated both approval and warning. The approval was because being requested by name by Dominic Hargrove was the kind of thing that could reshape a person's career. The warning was because being requested by name by Dominic Hargrove was also the kind of thing that could complicate a person's life in ways that were harder to describe. The conversations were small at first. The kind of small talk that isn't really small talk, but is instead the first layer of something larger being built without either person naming what they're building. Dominic asked about the food. He asked about the service. Once, he asked about the painting on the far wall, a large abstract piece in blue and gray that Caleb had looked at every shift and decided he liked without being able to say why. And Caleb told him what he thought honestly, without considering whether honesty was the right strategy. He said it looked like someone trying to remember something that was almost gone. Dominic had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that's exactly what it looks like." After that, the conversation stopped being small. Dominic was not the kind of person who talked about himself easily. Caleb could feel the effort it cost him. The way a door that has been closed for a long time resists the first push, not from stubbornness but from disuse, from the simple fact of having been shut for so long that the hinges have stiffened. But over the weeks that followed, in pieces and fragments, the way a story comes out when someone isn't ready to tell as a story, Caleb began to learn things. He learned that Dominic had built Hargrove Capital from a single investment made with money borrowed from a man who was no longer alive to be thanked. He learned that Dominic had been married once, for 11 years, to a woman named Catherine who had died of a heart condition 7 years ago, and that he still had the habit, still after 7 years, of reaching for his phone to tell her things. He learned that Dominic had a son, a grown son named Marcus, who ran the East Coast division of the firm, and that their relationship was something Dominic described as complicated in a way that made Caleb understand that complicated was the word a man used when the true word was too heavy to lift. What Caleb did not say, across all those Tuesdays and Thursdays, was anything about himself. Not because Dominic didn't ask. Dominic did ask. He asked in the careful, indirect way of someone who understood that a direct question would close the door he was trying to open. He asked about the work, about what Caleb had done before this, about what he was studying. He had noticed a textbook Caleb kept in his bag, a business economics course from a community college, and asked about it with what appeared to be genuine interest. But every time the conversation edged toward Caleb's past, toward anything that would require him to say out loud the things that lived in him the way old furniture lives in a room, present, familiar, impossible to move without rearranging everything else, Caleb redirected, smoothly, without apparent effort, the way you redirect a conversation when you have been doing it your whole life, because the truth of where you came from has never been safe to say. He was not ashamed of it. That was the thing he needed to be understood. He was not ashamed of the foster homes, of the garbage bags, of the boarding house, of any of it. Shame was the thing that required you to believe you had done something wrong. And Caleb had spent 21 years being very clear with himself that he had not done anything wrong. But experience had taught him something crueler than shame. It had taught him that the truth of who he was, the specific, documented, administrative truth, the truth that lived in files and records and systems he had never had the power to enter or exit on his own terms, had a way of changing how people saw him. Not always, not everyone, but often enough that he had learned to control the information the way you control anything fragile. Carefully, only when necessary, only when he was sure. He was not yet sure about Dominic Hargrove. December arrived. The holidays brought a specific kind of pressure to the Hargrove Grand. More events, more private dinners, more particular tension that gathers in rooms full of people who have too much money and too little to celebrate. Caleb worked 12-hour shifts without complaint. He sent the extra money to his savings account. He was $300 away from being able to pay for his next 2 college courses, and he ate the staff meal in the kitchen because it was good food and it saved him the cost of dinner. It was during one of these staff meals, on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, that Sandra sat down across from him with a cup of coffee and looked at him for a moment before speaking. She said, "Mr. Hargrove asked about your personnel file today." Caleb looked up from his food. Sandra said, "He asked Gerald about your background, where you were from, your references." Caleb kept his expression neutral. He was very good at this. "And Gerald told him what we have," Sandra said, "which is your application, your references from Rosie's Diner, and your community college enrollment." She paused. "Gerald also told him we hadn't run a background check beyond the standard one, because a position doesn't require a higher tier." Caleb said, "Okay." Sandra looked at him for another moment. He asked whether we had your birth certificate on file. The room was very quiet suddenly. Not literally quiet. The kitchen was always loud, the hiss of the dishwasher, and the radio someone always had on at low volume, and the background percussion of pots and pans. But in the specific interior space where Caleb processed things, the place that was very rarely surprised by anything, something had just gone very still. He said, "Why would he ask that?" Sandra shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Gerald thought it was about compliance. There's a financial services regulation thing. Something about staff who have access to private client dining. Some new policy about verified documentation." She did not sound entirely convinced by this. "But I don't know." Caleb said, "Do you need me to provide one?" Sandra looked at him carefully. "Not immediately. But, Caleb." She stopped. "Is there something I should know?" He looked back at her steadily. "No," he said. "There's nothing you need to know." This was true. It was also not the same as saying there was nothing. That night, Caleb lay on the narrow bed in his boarding house room and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The birth certificate question should not have mattered. Logically, it should not have mattered. He had a birth certificate. It was in a manila envelope in a lockbox under his bed, along with his social security card and his high school diploma and a single photograph of the woman with dark hair and tired eyes. The certificate was real. It was official. It had been provided to him by the county when he aged out of the system, along with a folder of documents they called your permanent record, delivered with a casualness that felt, even then, like an insult to the weight of the words. He pulled the box out. He opened the manila envelope. He unfolded the birth certificate on the bed in front of him and read it the way he had read it 100 times. His name, his date of birth, the city, Cook County, Illinois. Under father, unknown, under mother, a name, a real name, not crossed out, not redacted, a name that existed in the official record of his existence, a name he had looked up twice in his life and found nothing, a name that could belong to anyone or no one. He folded it back up. He put it back in the envelope. He put the box back under the bed. He lay back down on the ceiling and did what he always did when something was trying to get inside the careful, fortified space where he kept himself intact. He breathed, slowly, in and out, the way you breathe when you have learned that the feeling will pass, that everything passes, that the only thing that is permanent is a decision you made on a sidewalk at 18 years old to keep going. He fell asleep at 2 a.m. He was back at Hargrove Tower at 7:55. The next time Dominic Hargrove came into the private dining room, he sat down differently. Caleb noticed it immediately. The same corner table, the same suit, more or less the charcoal, always the charcoal, though sometimes the tie changed. But the way he sat was different. He sat like a man who had made a decision and was now in the uncomfortable period between making a decision and carrying it out. He waited until Caleb had brought the water and the bread and had turned to go before he spoke. He said, "Caleb." Caleb turned back. Dominic was looking at him with the expression Caleb had learned to recognize over these weeks, the one that looked like something between recognition and confusion, like seeing a word in a language you partially speak. "Sit down for a moment." Caleb said, "I'm on the floor, sir." "I know you are. I'll speak to Gerald." He gestured at the chair across from him. In 3 weeks of working the Hargrove Grand, Caleb had never sat at a table with a client. It was not done. It was, in fact, explicitly covered in the rules. But the rules, in this moment, felt like something written for a different kind of situation. He sat. Dominic studied him across the table for a moment. Then he said, "How old are you?" 21. "Where are you from?" "Chicago." "And before this position, what did you do?" Caleb said, "I washed dishes at a diner on West Madison for 3 years. Before that, I went to high school." Dominic was quiet. No family business. No college connections. No, nothing that would have put you in this room. "No," Caleb said. "Then how did you get here?" Caleb looked at him directly. "I applied." Something moved across Dominic's face. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile or the suppression of one. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at Caleb the way you look at something that is surprising you even though you came prepared to be surprised. He said, "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want you to know that however you answer it, you still have a job here. I want to be clear about that before I ask." Caleb said nothing. He waited. Dominic said, "Who was your mother?" The room was very quiet. Caleb said, "I don't know her." Dominic's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Her name." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. The careful, fortified space inside him was doing something it had never done before. Not cracking, not collapsing, but tilting. The way a building tilts in the seconds before you know whether it will fall or find its footing. He said, "Why are you asking me this?" Dominic said, "Because I need to know." "That's not a reason." "No," Dominic said quietly. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Her name." Caleb said the name that was on the birth certificate. Dominic Hargrove closed his eyes. He was quiet for so long that Caleb counted his own heartbeats. He got to 11 before Dominic opened his eyes again, and the expression in them was something Caleb had no category for. It was too many things at once. grief and shock, and something older than both, something that had the quality of a wound that had been covered so long that uncovering it felt both wrong and necessary. Dominic said, "What does your birth certificate say under father?" Caleb said, "Unknown." Dominic was quiet. Then he said, very quietly, "The way you say something that you cannot believe you're saying out loud after 21 years of not saying it. I knew her. I knew your mother. 22 years ago. Before Catherine. Before everything." He paused. "I was 22 years older than her. I was stupid and selfish, and I ended things badly. She left. I didn't look for her. I told myself she wanted it that way." He stopped again. "I didn't know." Caleb heard the words. He processed them. He put them through every mechanism he had, every layer of the person he had built with great care over 21 years, and what came back was not what he expected. What came back was not anger, not grief, not the thing he thought would happen when this moment came. And some part of him, the deepest part, the part that lived below decisions and plans and the daily work of survival, had always known some version of this moment would eventually come. What came back was a question. He said, "And now?" Dominic looked at him across the table. "I want to know you," he said, "if you'll let me." Caleb was quiet for a very long time. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "I need to get back to the floor." He walked out of the private dining room. He went to the kitchen. He stood at the sink and ran cold water over his wrist the way he had learned to do when something too large was happening inside him, the way you cool metal that has gotten too hot. Sandra found him there 2 minutes later and said, "Caleb, you okay?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him. "You don't look okay." He said, "I'm fine." He finished his shift. He did not go back to the private dining room. He took the bus home. He sat on his bed. He did not open the box under the bed. He looked at the ceiling for a very long time. He did not sleep. By 3 a.m, he had accepted the fact that he was not going to sleep, and he got up and made coffee and sat at the small table by the window where he usually did his coursework, and he opened his notebook to a blank page, and he wrote a single word at the top. He wrote, "Why?" Not as a question, as a starting point. Why now? Why him? Why was Dominic Hargrove, a man who had 62 floors of glass and steel with his name on it, sitting in a private dining room, looking at a 21-year-old waiter like he was something he had lost and found at the same time? Why had he asked about the birth certificate? Why had he asked before he even had conversation? What had tipped him off? What had made him look? What had he seen in Caleb's face that Caleb didn't know was there? He filled 4 pages, not with answers, with the architecture of the question, the way he had learned to do in the borrowed bedrooms and the library and the back tables at Rosie's, when something was too complicated to solve by simply pushing through it. He mapped it the way you map something you intend to navigate, carefully, with attention to where the solid ground was and where it wasn't. At 5 o'clock in the morning, he made a decision. He was going to go back to work. He was going to do his job. He was going to wait until he had more information than one extraordinary conversation delivered by a man who still had not provided him with a single piece of verifiable evidence, because Caleb Moore had not survived 21 years by accepting things at face value, no matter how much the face in question made him feel something he didn't have a word for yet. He was going to be careful. He was also going to get a DNA test. The DNA test was simpler to arrange than he expected, which was itself a kind of information. The world was full of mechanisms for this exact kind of question, the kind of question that lived in the space between who people said they were and who the evidence said they were. He ordered a kit online. It arrived in 3 days. He collected a sample, sealed it, sent it back. Then he waited. And while he waited, he did something he had never done before in 3 weeks of working the Hargrove Grand. He started paying attention to Dominic Hargrove the way he paid attention to things he was trying to understand. He had always watched him, of course. Watching was what Caleb did. But he had watched him the way you watch someone at a comfortable distance, noting the details that were visible from the surface. Now he watched closer, and what he saw when he looked closer was a man who was trying to hold himself together. It was in small things. The way Dominic's hands were still flat on the table, but slightly less steady than they had been. The way he arrived 5 minutes later than usual, which meant something had happened to delay him, and he had come anyway. The way he ate, or didn't eat, really. He ordered. He picked. He had the food in front of him and his mind somewhere else. The way you are somewhere else when you are living in a decision you've already made and are now just waiting to see what it costs. He did not ask Caleb to sit down again. He did not reference the conversation. He ordered his food and he thanked Caleb and he left. And he came back the next Tuesday and did the same thing. But he watched Caleb, not in a way that would be visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Caleb was always looking for it. On the third Tuesday after the conversation, Caleb set down Dominic's water glass and Dominic looked up and said, simply, "Have you thought about it?" Caleb said, "I'm waiting for more information." Dominic said, "What kind of information?" Caleb said, "The verifiable kind." Something in Dominic's face settled. Not hurt. The thing that settled was closer to respect, as if the answer was the right one, even if it was a harder one. He said, "What would you need?" Caleb said, "I've arranged a DNA test. I need a sample from you." Dominic said, "All right." Caleb said, "I'll have the information in a week." Dominic said, "All right." It was the shortest conversation they had ever had. It was also the most important, because what happened in that conversation, the thing underneath the words, the thing that lived in the way Dominic did not argue, did not qualify, did not ask Caleb to simply trust him, was the first suggestion that this man understood something essential about what it meant to be Caleb Moore. It meant not trusting things you couldn't verify. It meant not leaping at the first thing that looked like solid ground. It meant doing the work. The sample was collected the following morning. Gerald processed the paperwork without being told the reason, because the reason was not his business, and Caleb had learned that people who work in places like this are very good at not needing to know reasons. The results came back 8 days later. Caleb opened the email on his phone on his lunch break, sitting in the small staff room off the kitchen. He read the results. He read them again. He put his phone face down on the table. He sat very still for approximately 2 minutes. Then he picked up the phone and read them one more time. The match probability was 99.97%. He sat there in the small staff room with the sounds of the kitchen behind the door and the city outside the window, and he felt something happen inside him that he did not have a name for. Something that was not joy exactly, and not grief exactly, and not anger and not relief, but contained elements of all those things the way a chord contains notes, separately definable but only meaningful in combination. He had a father. He had a father who was 63 years old and had 62 floors of glass and steel with his name on it, and came to the private dining room on Tuesdays and Thursdays and asked for Caleb by name and had not argued when Caleb said he needed proof. He had a father who had not known he existed. He sat with that last part for a long time, not with anger. Anger required a target, and the man who had not known did not make a clean target, but with something that needed to be looked at honestly before anything else could happen. Because the thing that lived on the other side of that fact, on the other side of he did not know, was a question Caleb had been living in for 21 years. The question was not about Dominic Hargrove. The question was about the woman with dark hair and tired eyes and the picture in the garbage bag. The woman whose name was on the certificate. The woman who had chosen not to tell him. Why? He added it to the list in his notebook under the same heading. He called Dominic Hargrove at 7 o'clock that evening. He had been given the number by Sandra, who had given it to him at Dominic's request 3 weeks ago, with the same elevated eyebrows and the same complex mixture of approval and warning. The phone rang twice. Dominic answered on the second ring and said, "Caleb." Not hello, just the name, as if he had been sitting with his phone in his hand, waiting for it. Caleb said, "The results came back." A pause. And Caleb said, 99.97%. The line was quiet. For a long time it was quiet. Then Dominic said, in a voice that was completely different from the voice he used in the dining room, lower, rougher, stripped of everything that had been placed on top of over 63 years of being Dominic Hargrove. He said, "Caleb." Just that. Just his name again. Caleb said, "I'm not calling to make any claims. I'm not calling to change anything. He stopped. He started again. "I thought you should know what the results said." Dominic said, "Thank you." Caleb said, "I'll be at work Thursday." Dominic said, "I'll be there." Caleb said goodnight and ended the call and sat on the edge of his bed in the boarding house on the east side and let himself feel for exactly 4 minutes. He watched the clock, everything that was pressing against the inside of the person he had built. He let it move through him, all of it. The 21 years of not knowing, the garbage bag, the plastic chair, the foster homes, the sidewalk at 18, the jar under the bed, the library card, the single photograph, all of it. Then he breathed out. He got up. He ironed his shirt for Thursday. Thursday was different. Dominic came in at 12:15, which was slightly later than usual. He sat down at the corner table. He was wearing a different suit, navy, which Caleb had not seen before, and a tie the color of aged copper. He looked like a man who had dressed deliberately, which was different from a man who dressed well without thinking about it. He looked up when Caleb approached and said, "Sit with me." "Caleb," said Gerald. Dominic said, "I own the building." Caleb sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet around them. 2 other tables occupied, both far enough away that they existed in a separate atmosphere. The light came through the windows and the long slanted angles of a December afternoon. Dominic said, "I want to tell you something, and then I want to hear from you, if you'll let me. Whatever you want to say." Caleb said, "All right." Dominic said, "When I saw you the first time, the very first time you came to this table, I felt something that I didn't understand, and I told myself I was wrong, because the alternative was, it was too large. I told myself I was looking at a young man who reminded me of someone, and that was all." He stopped. "I've been telling myself I was wrong about things for 22 years. Caleb said, "What did you think you saw?" Dominic looked at him directly. "Your mother's eyes. My father's hands." He paused. "My father had the same hands. The stillness in them. My father was a very still man. He said once that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room was be the calmest thing in it." Caleb looked at his own hands on the table. Dominic said, "She was 23. I was 41. I told myself the age difference meant nothing, and that was true. But what was not true was telling myself I was ready for what it meant. I wasn't ready. I was still becoming whoever I was going to be, even at 41, and I handled it badly. I ended things in a way that closed the door completely. And she left Chicago. I didn't know where she went." "I don't know either," Caleb said. Dominic was quiet. "You've looked." "Twice. I couldn't find her." He paused. "She left me in the system when I was 4. They told me she listed me as voluntarily surrendered." He said those words with the flatness of someone who has had a long time to make peace with a thing that is not peaceful. "I don't know if she was sick. I don't know if she was scared. I don't know." Dominic's jaw worked. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried a weight that had nothing to do with the social function of the phrase. They carried the weight of a man who understood that he was one of the links in a chain that had produced a 4-year-old sitting on a plastic chair with a garbage bag. Caleb said, "I'm not looking for an apology." Dominic said, "No, I know, but I'm giving you one anyway. Not because it fixes anything, because it's true." Caleb absorbed this. He looked at the man across the table. This stranger who was not a stranger, who had the building named after him, and the navy suit and the hands that matched his own, and he did something he had not allowed himself to do yet. He let himself look at the man the way you look at something you might, under very specific and carefully considered conditions, allow yourself to have. He said, "What do you want from this?" Dominic said, "I want to know you. I want you to know that you have someone, if you want that." He paused. "I know you built your life without anyone. I know that's not nothing. I'm not asking you to need me. I'm asking if there's room." Caleb said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I have a test on Monday. Business economics." Dominic blinked slightly. "Okay. I've been studying for 3 weeks. I usually score high on tests because I study more than anyone else." Dominic said, "Yes, I imagine you do." Caleb said, "I want to finish a degree. I'm paying for it myself, 1 course at a time. It takes longer, but I know every dollar of it." Dominic said, "I understand. I'm not telling you that so you'll offer to pay," Caleb said. I'm telling you because it's important that you understand who I am before you decide you want to know me. I'm not looking for a shortcut. I don't want things handed to me. I've made everything I have from nothing, and that matters to me. Dominic looked at him. I know, he said. I can see that. It's the first thing I saw. Caleb said, then we can talk. Slowly. He paused. I'm going to need more time than you probably think is reasonable. Dominic said, I have time. I'm serious. So am I? Caleb nodded. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. I'll get your food, he said. Dominic almost smiled. Yes, please. What followed was slow. Caleb was not someone who moved fast toward things he didn't trust yet, and trust for him was not a decision. It was a process, a slow accumulation of evidence, the way you build anything solid, one verified thing at a time. He continued to serve Dominic his lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He continued to be Caleb on the floor, careful, precise, attentive in a way that made Sandra tell Gerald he was one of the best hires they'd made in 3 years. But he began to talk, not in the dining room. That was too exposed, too formal, too surrounded by the structure of their original dynamic, which both of them needed to move beyond. They began to meet once a week on Saturday mornings at a coffee place Caleb chose because it was in his neighborhood and because choosing the place felt important. The coffee place was not fancy. It was a narrow storefront on a street that had been trying to gentrify for 5 years without quite succeeding, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and very good coffee, because the owner cared about the coffee more than about how the chairs matched. Dominic came the first Saturday in a car that made Caleb's neighbors look out their windows. He said nothing about the car or the neighborhood. He sat in the mismatched chair and ordered black coffee and put his phone in his pocket and did not take it out again for 2 hours. They talked. Caleb learned more pieces. He learned that Dominic's childhood had not been what the building's lobby suggested, that he had grown up in a modest house in South Chicago, with a father who worked at a plant that closed when Dominic was 14, and who never quite recovered from that closing, in the way that men of that generation, and that kind of pride sometimes didn't. He learned that the first money Dominic made was not glamorous. It was a product of obsessive reading and one very good call made very young, and the willingness to borrow against the future in a way that could have destroyed him and didn't, but barely. He learned that the success had come with a specific kind of loneliness that Dominic had never known how to address, because addressing it felt like complaining about something that most people would have been grateful for. Caleb recognized that loneliness. He recognized it the way you recognize a dialect. Not your own, but close enough that the sounds make sense. Dominic learned pieces, too. He learned about the foster homes. Caleb gave them to him in the flat. Efficient way he gave everything difficult, not dramatizing but not softening either. He learned about Rosie's Diner and the library card and the $117 he had saved over 3 years before he found out about the job at the Hargrove Grand. He learned about the garbage bag because Caleb told him, specifically, deliberately, watching Dominic's face while he told it, because the way someone reacted to the garbage bag told you something about whether they were really listening or whether they were just waiting for the story to be over so they could say something reassuring. Dominic did not say something reassuring. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "What was in the bag?" Caleb told him. The broken crayon, the stuffed dog with one eye, the photograph. Dominic said, "Do you still have it?" The photograph. Caleb said, "Yes." Dominic said, "I'd like to see it, if you'd want that. Someday." Caleb said, "Someday." That word, that one word, was a bridge neither of them stood on yet, but both of them knew was being built. Marcus Hargrove found out on a Thursday. Caleb did not know how Marcus found out. He suspected that information in a firm like Hargrove Capital moved the way information in powerful places always moved, through the spaces between things, through assistants and advisors, and the quiet professional network of people who noticed what powerful men were doing with their time and considered that noticing part of their job. He knew Marcus had found out because Dominic called him that Thursday evening with a different quality in his voice. The voice he used with Caleb had, over 6 weeks, acquired a kind of ease. Not comfortable exactly. Ease was a wrong word, because what was between them was too new and too strange to be comfortable, but open. The voice he used that Thursday was something else. It was the voice of a man who had been in a difficult conversation, and had not yet fully returned from it. He said, "Marcus knows." Caleb said, "Okay." Dominic said, "He's not. It's going to take him time." Caleb said, "I understand." He did. He genuinely did. He had no illusions about what this looked like from Marcus's side, a young waiter appearing in his father's life at 63 claiming to be his son, with a DNA result that could be challenged or questioned or contextualized in any number of ways by a man who had good lawyers and sufficient motivation to use them. He did not expect Marcus Hargrove to embrace the situation. But what Caleb had not been prepared for was Marcus Hargrove coming to the Hargrove Grand. He came on a Tuesday morning during the lunch service, when Caleb was on the floor. He was 38 years old, tall like his father, with sharper features and the kind of energy that arrived in a room before he did, that low-frequency hum of someone accustomed to controlling situations. He was not unkind in his appearance. He was not, Caleb understood immediately, a villain. He was a man whose world had just been reorganized without his permission, and who was responding the way people respond when the ground shifts. He sat at a table in the main room, not the private room. Caleb was assigned to the private room, but he saw Marcus come in, and he felt the change in the room's temperature the way you feel a draft from a door that opened in another part of the building. Sandra assigned a different server to Marcus's table. During the service, Caleb was in and out of the main room twice. Both times he was aware of Marcus watching him, not aggressively, but precisely with the focused evaluation of someone constructing a complete picture. After the service, as Caleb was wrapping up his side work, Marcus appeared in the corridor outside the kitchen. He said, "You're Caleb." Caleb said, "Yes." Marcus looked at him. He was quiet for a moment in a way that had nothing of his father's contemplative quiet in it. It was active, calculating, the quiet of a man considering options. Then he said, "I won't be direct with you." Caleb said, "Please." "My father is 63 years old. He lost my mother 7 years ago. He has spent the last 7 years rebuilding something in himself that I'm not sure is fully rebuilt." He paused. "Whatever this is, whatever you believe it to be, whatever he believes it to be, I need you to understand that I am going to be watching." Caleb said, "That's fair." Marcus blinked slightly, recalibrated. "I'm not looking for a fight." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not either." He looked at Marcus directly. "I didn't come looking for your father. I applied for a job. Everything that followed was his doing as much as mine. I have no interest in his money, his name, or anything he can give me. I'm telling you this not because you asked, but because I think you need to hear it." Marcus studied him. "How do I know that?" Caleb said, "You don't. Not yet." He paused. "You'll have to do what I did. Take the time to find out." A long silence. Then Marcus said, "He talks about you." Caleb said nothing. "He's talked more in the last 6 weeks than he has in the last 2 years. Marcus said, and there was something complicated in his voice. Not resentment, or not only resentment, but something that had more grief in it than anger. "I don't know what to do with that." Caleb said, "Don't have to do anything with it right now." Marcus looked at him one more time. Then he said, "All right," and he left. Christmas came. Caleb worked Christmas Eve. He worked it because he needed the money and because he had nowhere else to be, which was the same calculation he had made for every Christmas of his adult life and most of the ones before it. He worked the floor with the efficient, quiet competence that had become his signature, serving people who were celebrating the way that people who have always had things to celebrate do it, easily, without thinking too hard about the ease. He took the bus home at 10 o'clock. He heated up leftover pasta on the hot plate. He sat at the small table and opened his textbook and read the same page 3 times without absorbing any of it. His phone buzzed at 10:45. It was a text from Dominic. The text said, "I know you're probably studying, but if you're not too tired, there's something I'd like to give you. It can wait, but I didn't want to not ask." Caleb looked at the text for a while. Then he looked at the pasta. Then he looked at the page of the textbook he had not been reading. He texted back, "What is it?" Dominic texted back, "It would be better in person." Caleb stared at the ceiling of his room for 30 seconds. Then he put on his coat. The address Dominic texted was not the tower. It was an apartment building 12 blocks north, a tall, quietly expensive building on Lakeshore Drive with a doorman and a lobby full of holiday flowers. Caleb arrived at 11:15 and felt, for just a moment, the particular discomfort of being the kind of person who was aware of how he looked walking into lobbies like this one. He breathed through it and went in. Dominic met him at the elevator on the 24th floor. He was in a sweater and slacks, no tie, no suit, and it was the first time Caleb had seen him dressed that way, without the formal armor of the professional world, and it made him look different, smaller, in a way, but more present. The apartment behind him was full of books and good light, and the particular organized comfort of a person who had lived alone long enough to know exactly how they wanted things. He handed Caleb an envelope. Caleb looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it." Caleb opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a letter handwritten on plain paper. He read it. It was not a check. It was not a document. It was a letter that said, in Dominic's careful, slightly formal handwriting, that he had spent 6 weeks trying to figure out what you give someone who has built everything themselves and doesn't want it taken away. That he had understood from the very first time Caleb told him about the degree and the way he was paying for it, that money was not the right shape for what he wanted to offer. That what he wanted to offer was something he had been sitting with for weeks, trying to find the right words for. He wanted to offer the thing that Caleb had never had. Not money, not connections, not his name, which Caleb had not asked for, and which would always be Caleb's choice if he ever wanted it. He wanted to offer the simple, daily, completely ordinary fact of someone knowing where Caleb was, of someone who would notice if he didn't answer, of someone who would call on a Tuesday because it was Tuesday, not because there was a reason, of presence, of the boring, unremarkable, life-altering gift of being someone's first call. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He said, "You know I might not be ready for all of that." Dominic said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to need to go at my own speed." Dominic said, "I know that too." He said, "And I'm going to pass that test on Monday." Dominic said, "I have no doubt." Caleb stood in the doorway of the apartment on the 24th floor with a handwritten letter in his pocket and looked at the man who was, by every verifiable measure, his father, and felt the ground under him shift in a different direction than it had shifted in a very long time. Not dangerous, not precarious. The kind of shift that happens when something settles into a place you didn't know had been empty. He said, "Merry Christmas." Dominic said, "Merry Christmas, Caleb." Caleb went home. He sat at the small table. He did not open the textbook. He took the letter out of his coat pocket and read it one more time. Then he put it with a photograph in the manila envelope in the lockbox under his bed. He slept better than he had in 21 years. January was when things got complicated. It was not Dominic who made things complicated. It was not Marcus who had begun to do what he said he would do. Watch, quietly, without aggression, with the slow and careful movement of a man learning to revise what he thought he knew. It was not anything that came from inside the careful, slowly expanding space of what Caleb and Dominic were building. It came from outside. A journalist, a woman named Brianna Seltz, who wrote for a financial publication that covered private equity and the families attached to it. The kind of publication that operated at the exact intersection of business news and the personal lives of people who preferred their personal lives stay out of business news. She called the Hargrove Grand on a Thursday morning and asked for information about Caleb Moore, described as a member of the food and beverage staff. Sandra told Gerald. Gerald told Caleb. Caleb listened to this information with the flat, still expression he used when something large was happening that he needed to process before he could respond to it. He said, "Who told her?" Nobody knew, or nobody was willing to say. He called Dominic that afternoon from the staff room. Dominic said, before Caleb could finish explaining, "I know. My PR team flagged it an hour ago. She's been asking questions for 3 days." Caleb said, "What kind of questions?" "About the DNA test. About our meetings. About," Dominic paused, "about your background." The careful, fortified space inside Caleb did something it did not do often. It contracted slightly, not from fear, but from a specific, familiar sensation of the world reaching for something he had not given it permission to touch. The foster homes, the garbage bag, the plastic chair, his mother's name on a birth certificate, the things that belonged to him. the things that were nobody's story but his. He said, "What do you want to do?" Dominic said, "What do you want to do? This is your life. This is your story. I will do whatever you tell me to do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm not hiding. I've never hidden anything." He paused. "But I'm also not performing my own life for someone else's article." Dominic said, "Then we don't talk to her." Caleb said, "She'll write something anyway." "Yes," Dominic said, "she will. And it will be incomplete and partly wrong, and it will make some people look at you differently for a little while. And then something else will happen in the world, and they'll look at that instead." Caleb said, "You've dealt with this before." "Many times," Dominic said. "The story isn't theirs. It's yours. No article changes that." Caleb said, "All right." There was a pause. Then Dominic said, "Caleb, I want you to know something. Whatever is written, whatever is said, I'm not going anywhere." Caleb said, "I know." He said it like he meant it, like he had practice meaning it and was almost all the way there. The article ran on a Friday. Caleb read it on his phone on the bus on the way to work. He read it with the same careful, methodical attention. He gave everything he read, which meant he did not skim, did not jump to the end, did not skip the parts that were uncomfortable. The article was not cruel. It was not dishonest. Exactly. It had the shape of honesty, the vocabulary of careful journalism, the hedge words and the sources familiar with the situation, and the acknowledgement that neither party had commented. But it had a quality that Caleb recognized immediately because he had been on the receiving end of it before in smaller, less published ways. The quality of a story that was about you, but not for you. The quality of someone else deciding what the most important things about your life were and arranging them in an order that served their narrative. The headline said, "Hargrove Air Mystery. Billionaire's alleged son worked as server at private club." The word alleged. The word mystery. The decision to leave with the job. Not with the man. Not with the years. Not with any of the actual substance. But with the image of a waiter in a dining room that the article spent 3 paragraphs describing in a way that made the gap between the dining room and the waiter feel as wide as possible. Caleb put his phone in his pocket. He went to work. He did his job with the same precision and efficiency he always brought to it. And if something in him was working through the article while he moved through the room, nobody could see it. That was what 21 years of managing large internal weather, without external evidence, looked like from the outside. It looked like competence. Sandra pulled him aside during the mid-service break and said, "I want you to know that Gerald and I have both read it, and we're not." She stopped. "The room is full of people today who have also read it. You should know that." Caleb said, "Okay." She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Caleb." He looked at her. "I've been managing things people wrote about my life since I was 4 years old," he said. "Every case file, every placement record, every foster care review, every document in my permanent record that described me in terms I didn't choose." He paused. "This is the same. It's just louder." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's, yes." She paused. "You should know that 3 of the members have asked about you this morning. By name. Not in a bad way." Caleb absorbed this. "What did they ask?" "They asked if you were all right," Sandra said. "Mr. Edelman specifically said to tell you that he thought the article was, and I'm quoting him directly, cheap and poorly sourced." Caleb almost smiled. Mr. Edelman with his water and no ice and his fingers that were bothered by cold. "Tell him thank you," he said. He went back to the floor. Dominic called that afternoon, and Caleb let it go to voicemail and then listened to the voicemail on the bus home. The voicemail said, "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I'll be at the coffee shop Saturday if you want to come. If you don't want to come, I understand. But I'll be there." Caleb texted back, "I'll be there." Saturday came. The coffee shop was the same as always. Mismatched chairs, chalkboard menu. The owner behind the counter who had started to recognize Caleb and Dominic not as who they were, but simply as regulars, which was the best thing a coffee shop could give you. They sat across from each other, and Dominic said, before Caleb could say anything, "I want to address the article." Caleb said, "You don't need to." Dominic said, "I do." Because part of how it happened was my team, not intentionally, but there was a conversation with a communications consultant that was less contained than it should have been, and that's on me. He paused. I should have controlled that better. Caleb looked at him. It doesn't change anything. Dominic said, No, but I needed you to know I'm aware of my part in it. Caleb nodded. Then he said, The word alleged. Dominic said, Yes. Caleb said, The test was 99.97%. There's nothing alleged about it. Dominic said, No, there isn't. Caleb said, I want you to know that I'm not. He stopped. Organize the words more carefully. I'm not embarrassed. Not by the job. Not by where I come from. Not by any of it. If someone reads that article and walks away thinking less of me because I was a waiter while being your son, then what they think of me has nothing to do with who I am. Dominic said, very quietly, I know that. Caleb said, I just wanted to say it out loud. I'm glad you did. They sat with their coffee for a while. Outside, the street was doing its usual Saturday morning thing. Delivery trucks and people walking dogs and the distant sound of the city existing in all its ordinary, unremarkable continuity. Dominic said, I spoke to Marcus. Caleb said, and... He read the article. He paused. He said, Dominic stopped, started again. He said that the article made him feel defensive, and that the thing he was defending was you. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said, That's unexpected. Dominic said, Yes, but Marcus is a better man than he lets himself appear to be most of the time. He's afraid of being replaced, afraid of what it means that there was a part of my life he didn't know about. But underneath the fear, he's a good man. Caleb thought about this, about the corridor outside the kitchen and Marcus's voice when he said, He's talked more in the last 6 weeks than he has in the last 2 years. The grief in that, the complicated, layered grief of someone who loved a person and had been sitting beside that person's silence for years, not knowing that the silence had a shape. He said, What did you tell him? Dominic said, I told him that nothing had changed about what he is to me, and that what I was building with you was not the same thing as what I had built with him, that there was room, that love, the real kind, it doesn't run out, it expands. He paused. He said he needed to think about that. Caleb said he's allowed to. Yes, Dominic said, he is. February was colder than usual. Chicago in February was always itself, defiant, relentless, a city that had spent 2 centuries arguing with the weather and losing and showing up the next morning anyway. Caleb walked through it every morning with his collar turned up, his hands in his pockets, his breath coming out in clouds that the wind immediately dispersed. He passed his business economics test. He scored 94. He enrolled in 2 more courses. He kept working the floor at the Hargrove Grand, and the members who had read the article treated him, almost universally, in one of 2 ways, with careful, deliberate normalcy, as if demonstrating that they were the kind of people who treated others normally regardless of circumstances, or with the slightly warmer attention of people who had read something and felt something and were expressing it through the only channel available, which was asking for extra bread or an additional pour of coffee with slightly more warmth than was strictly necessary. He found both responses touching in a way he could not have explained to anyone who hadn't spent their life watching rooms. Marcus came to the coffee shop on the first Saturday in February. He did not call ahead. He simply appeared, a tall figure in a coat, who came through the door and looked at the 2 of them at their usual table and said, I hope this is all right. Dominic looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Marcus. He said, Sit down. Marcus sat. He ordered coffee. He put his phone in his pocket. And then he said, with the directness of someone who prepared something and was now saying it before he could change his mind, I owe you an apology. Caleb said, You don't. Marcus said, Yes, I do. I came to your workplace, and I was territorial, and I made it about protecting my father from you, and it wasn't about my father, it was about me feeling like something was being taken, and you didn't take anything. He paused. You showed up and you were honest, and you waited and you got a DNA test instead of just believing what you were told, and all of that is more than I would have done. Caleb said, You didn't know what I was made of yet. Marcus said, No, I didn't. A pause. I do now. The three of them sat in the coffee shop with its mismatched chairs for the next 2 hours. They talked, haltingly at first and then less so, about things that were not on any agenda, about work, about the city, about the particular challenge of being a person inside an institution that had your name on it, which was something Marcus knew about, and which Caleb, in a very different way, was beginning to understand. At some point, Caleb said, "I don't want the name on the building." Marcus looked at him. Caleb said, "I want to be clear about that. I'm Caleb Moore. I've been Caleb Moore for 21 years. Whatever this is," he gestured in a way that encompassed the table, the coffee, the two men across from him. "It doesn't change my name." Dominic said, "I would never ask you to change your name." Marcus said, slowly, "Moore was your mother's?" Caleb said, "I chose it. When I aged out of the system, you can choose or keep what you're registered under. They registered me as Moore because that was what was on the certificate. I kept it because it was the only thing I had that came from her." A silence. Marcus said, He stopped. "I didn't know you could choose." Caleb said, "Most people don't know how much of the system works." Marcus said, "No, I don't think most people do." Something settled at the table in that moment. Not resolution. It was too early for resolution. Too early for the full, complicated geography of what they were becoming to each other to have been mapped. But something like the beginning of honest ground. The kind of ground you could actually stand on. In March, Dominic asked Caleb something he had not asked before. They were at the apartment on Lake Shore Drive for the first time since Christmas Eve. Dominic had made dinner. Not with any great skill, but with the earnest, focused effort of someone who had decided that making dinner was important and was going to execute it correctly even if it took 4 attempts at the sauce. The dinner was good. They ate at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, which felt right. After, Dominic said, "What do you want?" "Not from me. Not from any of this. What do you want from your life?" Caleb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said, "I want to finish the degree. Business, probably. Maybe finance eventually." He paused. "I want to understand how money works. Not because I want a lot of it, but because it's the language of the world I'm living in, and I want to speak it fluently." Dominic said, "That's a good reason." Caleb said, "And I want to do something with it that has to do with what I know. What I actually know from experience." He paused, choosing the words carefully. There are a lot of kids who age out of the foster system with nothing. Less than nothing. They have negative nothing. Because the system has taken years from them that they now have to make up without any of the scaffolding that the kids who weren't in the system had the whole time. I want to do something about that. Eventually. I don't know the shape of it yet. Dominic was quiet for a long time. He said, "I do." Caleb looked at him. Dominic said, "I've been thinking about it since November. Since you told me about the 7 homes and the garbage bag and the sidewalk at 18. He paused. "I have resources that I have not known what to do with. Not in the sense of not having causes. I have causes. I give to causes. But I mean personally. The specific, personal application of what I have to what matters." He looked at Caleb. "You know what matters. I have what you need to do something about it. That's not a coincidence." Caleb said, "I'm not ready for that conversation yet." Dominic said, "I know, but I wanted to have it in the room." Caleb said, "In the room." Dominic said, "Yes, where both of us can see it's there." Caleb looked across the kitchen table at this man, this stranger who was not a stranger, who made dinner with focused effort and kept books on every surface and had his father's hands and had done a hard thing badly 22 years ago and was doing a hard thing right now and knew it and felt something complete itself. Not all of it, not the whole thing. You don't complete a whole thing in 3 months. You complete it in years, in daily and ordinary and unremarkable accumulations, in Tuesday phone calls and Saturday coffee, and 1,000 small moments of being known that constitute, in total, a life that is witnessed. But something, he said, "You put too much salt in the sauce." Dominic said, "I know. I did it 3 times trying to get it right, and it kept being wrong." Caleb said, "I can cook." Dominic said, "Can you?" Caleb said, "My 3rd foster home. The woman there, Mrs. Patterson. She cooked everything from scratch. I was with her for 2 years, and I paid attention. Dominic said, 2 years was a long time for you. Caleb said, longest I stayed anywhere. A quiet moment. Dominic said, what happened? Caleb said, she got sick. They moved me. He paused. I used to think about her. Wonder if she got better. Another pause. I found her 3 years ago. She did get better. She has 4 biological grandchildren now. She still cooks everything from scratch. Dominic said, did you reach out to her? Caleb said, I sent a card. Anonymous. I didn't know how to explain it. Dominic said very gently, maybe now you would. Caleb looked at him. Then he looked at the table. Then he said, maybe. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, argumentatively, in fits and starts, warm for 3 days and then cold again. The trees starting to do something hopeful and then being told they were being premature. The whole season feeling like a negotiation rather than an arrival. Caleb turned 22 in April. He had not celebrated a birthday in any meaningful sense since the 5th foster home. With the 3rd year, he was there the family had remembered and gotten a store-bought cake that he had eaten 3 pieces of without saying thank you because he was 13, and 13 was when he had learned to manage expectations by not having them. Since then, birthdays have been days. Good days when there was extra money. Bad days when there wasn't, but just days. This one was not just a day. Dominic called in the morning. Marcus texted. A brief, slightly awkward text that had the quality of someone who was not yet comfortable with what they were doing, but was doing it anyway, because they had decided to do it. Sandra at the Hargrove Grand put a small envelope in his locker that had a card signed by everyone on the floor staff, which was not something that had ever happened to Caleb in his life. He sat in the staff room during his break and read the card and felt something completely undramatic and enormous happen in his chest. The kind of thing that doesn't make a sound but takes up the whole room. That evening, Dominic had reserved a table, not at the Hargrove Grand, somewhere else, somewhere Caleb had never been, a restaurant in a neighborhood he didn't know, the kind of place that was excellent without performing its excellence. Marcus came. The 3 of them ate and talked and argued, gently, about whether a particular investment Dominic had made in the 1990s had been brilliant or lucky, and whether there was actually a difference, and Caleb offered an opinion that surprised both of them, and that Dominic later said was, upon reflection, almost exactly right. At some point in the evening, Marcus looked at Caleb across the table with an expression that Caleb had not seen from him before, unguarded, real, not assessing but simply looking, and said, he's going to use your argument in meetings now, you know. He's going to claim he already thought it. Caleb said, I know. I watched him do it with a point about regional markets 3 weeks ago. Dominic said with complete dignity, I refined the point. There's a difference. Caleb and Marcus looked at each other. For the first time, they smiled at the same thing at the same time. It is necessary at this point in the story to be honest about the thing that was still unresolved. Because stories that are honest about people are honest about the things that people have not yet fixed, the things that are still open and sore and complicated even when everything else is getting better. The thing that was still open was Caleb's mother. Her name lived in him the way the photograph lived in the box. Present, constant, impossible to ignore. In the 6 months since he had sat down with Dominic in the private dining room, he had learned the shape of many things. He had learned the shape of his father. He was learning the shape of something that might, over time, become a family. He was learning the shape of what it felt like to be someone's first call, someone's Saturday morning, someone's complicated and ongoing and imperfect and real priority. But he did not know the shape of why she had left, why she had not told Dominic, why she had listed him as voluntarily surrendered when he was 4 years old, and then disappeared from every record he had ever searched. He did not know if she was alive. He did not know if she was sick or afraid, or whether there had been something in her that simply could not hold on, the way there is in some people a pain so large and so old that it cannot be seen from the inside. He did not know if she had ever thought about him. He did not talk about this often. He had mentioned it to Dominic in the early weeks. Factually, and Dominic had listened and not tried to interpret it or solve it. He had mentioned it once to Marcus, sideways, in the context of a different conversation, and Marcus had been quiet in a way that communicated understanding without commentary. But the not knowing lived in him. It always had. And the difference now was that there were people who knew it lived there, which was different from carrying alone. In May, Dominic came to the Saturday coffee shop with an expression that Caleb recognized as, "I have information I'm not sure how to give you." He had learned that expression. It had only appeared twice before, once when an article ran, and once when there had been a complication at the firm that he needed to tell Caleb about, because it had implications for something they had been discussing. Both times, the expression meant something real was coming. Caleb said, "What is it?" Dominic said, "My private investigator found something." Caleb was very still. He said, "You hired a private investigator to find her." Dominic said, "I should have asked you first. I know that. I'm sorry." Caleb said, "What did they find?" Dominic said, "She's alive. She's in a city about 300 miles from here. She's been there for 17 years. He paused. "She has a small apartment. She works at a library. She's not well. Not critically. But there are health challenges. She lives alone." Caleb sat with this information for a very long time. A library. She worked at a library. He had spent years in libraries, using them the way other people use homes. He had used the books in them as the thing that replaced what other people got from families. He had sat in the reading rooms and felt, in some way he'd never examined too closely, that libraries were places where the lost things were kept. She was in a library. He said, "Does she know you found her?" Dominic said, "No." The investigator was discreet. "We have her address. Nothing more." Caleb said, "I need to think about this." Dominic said, "Of course." Caleb said, I don't know how I feel about the fact that you hired someone." Dominic said, "I know. I'm sorry. I wanted to." He stopped. "I wanted to be able to give you something. I understand that wasn't mine to give." Caleb said, "No, it wasn't." He paused. "But I'm glad I know." He left the coffee shop at noon and walked for 3 hours, not looking for anything, not going anywhere specific, just walking, which was what he did when something too large to sit still with needed to move through him at a pace he could manage. He walked along the lake. He walked through neighborhoods he knew and neighborhoods he didn't. He walked past a library branch on North Clark and stopped outside it and looked at the door for a long time. Then he kept walking. He did not make the decision for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, he went to work and studied and took his Saturday coffees with Dominic and had dinner with Marcus once, at a Thai place Marcus chose, and that Caleb thought was mediocre but said nothing about, because some things are more important than being right about Thai food. He thought about the woman in the apartment 300 miles away. He thought about the library where she worked. He thought about the photograph in the box, the dark hair, the tired eyes, the fact that someone had taken that picture and given it to her and she'd given it to him, or left it where someone found it with him. He thought about the 4-year-old on the plastic chair. He thought about what his therapist. He had started seeing a therapist in February, which was something Dominic had suggested and which Caleb had initially resisted and then agreed to and was now glad of, had said about the difference between understanding something and forgiving it, and about how sometimes people left not because they chose to leave, but because something in them had failed them at exactly the moment they needed it most. Not as an excuse. As a fact, he thought about what it would mean to go, what would mean not to go. He thought about the 22 years of not knowing, and whether knowing could ever be fully separated from those years, and whether that separation was even the goal. On the first Saturday in June, he told Dominic he was going. Dominic said, "Do you want company?" Caleb thought about this carefully. "No," he said, "not for this part." Dominic said, "All right." Caleb said, "But I want you to know where I'm going." Dominic said, "I know where you're going." Caleb said, "And I want to know you'll be here when I get back." Dominic said, "I'll be here." He took the train. He sat by the window for 3 hours and watched the landscape of the Midwest flatten and expand in a particular way it does once you leave the city. The big skies, the fields, the sense of being very small in a very large and unhurried world. He had a book in his bag that he did not open. He had his phone in his pocket that he checked twice and then put away. He had the photograph, not a copy, the original, which he had not removed from the box since the night he was 18, and laid it on the bed in the boarding house, and made his decision. he had taken out that morning and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and had not looked at it since. He arrived at the station and took a bus to the address. It was a residential street in a neighborhood that was quiet in the way that streets are quiet when nothing dramatic has happened there in a long time. The apartment building was 5 stories, brick, with flower boxes in some of the windows. The kind of building that was lived in genuinely by people for whom it was home. He stood on the sidewalk across the street. He stood there for 12 minutes. Then he crossed the street. He pressed a buzzer for the apartment number he had been given. He waited. A woman's voice, slightly hoarse, a little surprised, said, "Yes?" He said, "My name is Caleb Moore." He paused. He had thought about this sentence for 3 weeks. "I think you might be my mother." A very long silence. Then the door buzzed open. She was 53 years old. She was not what he expected. But then he had the photograph, and the photograph was 25 years old. And the photograph was not a woman, but a memory of a woman. And the woman who opened the door of the 5th-floor apartment was something separate from both of those things. She was smaller than the photograph suggested. She had the dark hair still, more silver now than dark, worn short in a practical way. Her eyes were the same. He recognized them immediately, the specific shape of them, and felt a jolt that was not sentiment but recognition, the deep biological kind, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. She was wearing a cardigan over a blue shirt, and she looked like someone who had just been doing something ordinary, which she had been, because this was an ordinary afternoon, and he had arrived in it without warning. She looked at him. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "You look like him." He said, "I know." She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The apartment was small but full. Books everywhere, expected, given the library, given everything. A small kitchen, a table by the window with a coffee cup on it still steaming. Plants on the windowsill, all alive, which told him something. A person who kept plants alive was a person who got up every morning and remembered. She gestured at the chair across from the table. He sat. She sat at the table, both hands wrapped around the coffee cup, and looked at him. She said, "How did you find me?" He said, "I had help." She said, "How long have you known about him?" He said, 7 months. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she said, "I never told him. I couldn't. I thought," she stopped, "I was afraid of what he would think, of what it would mean. And then I was somewhere else, and things were, I was not well for a long time. I made choices I would make differently now." She paused. "That's not enough." He said, "No, it isn't." She said, "I know." The room was very quiet. He said, "I'm not here to," he stopped, organize the words again. He had learned this, the organizing. It did not come naturally to him to be kind to his own emotions while also being honest. But he was learning. "I'm not here to blame you. And I'm not here to forgive you, because I don't know yet if I can. I'm here because you're a question I've been living inside for 21 years, and I needed to see you." She said, "And now that you see me?" He said, "I don't know yet." She nodded, very slowly. "That's fair." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out the photograph. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it for a long time. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. She did not reach for it. She said, "You kept it." He said, "It was the only thing I had." She looked at him. Her eyes were full of something that was not one thing. The complicated, layered fullness of a person looking at the consequences of their life through the face of someone they loved imperfectly and lost, and had been carrying the losing of for 22 years. She said, "Are you all right?" "Are you is your life." He said, "Yes," and meant it. "My life is good. I made it good." She said, "I can see that." A pause. "You didn't need me to make it good." He said, "No, I didn't." He paused. "But I might need something from you now. Not support, not parenting. Something smaller." She said, "What?" He said, "Answers. Whatever you can give me. The parts one don't have." She said, "I can do that." He said, "And I'd like to come back." "Not," he stopped. "I don't know what this is. I don't know what it can be. But I'd like to come back and find out. She said yes. The word came out with the particular weight of something a person has been holding for a very long time and has finally been given permission to set down. Yes, please. They talked for 3 hours. She told him things about the 22 years she carried, about the decision that was not a decision but a failure, about the illness that had been the failing and the recovery that had been the attempt, about the library where she had found something like purpose in the work of keeping things and making them available, of cataloging and organizing and ensuring that what was lost could be found. He listened. He did not perform forgiveness. He did not perform anger. He was simply there, in the chair, with the coffee she made him that he drank because it was warm and the apartment was quiet, and outside the window the late spring light was doing something gentle with the plants on the sill. He left at 4 o'clock. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building, and he called Dominic. Dominic answered immediately. Caleb. Caleb said, I saw her. A pause. And Caleb said, and I need some time to think. But he stopped, breathed. I think I might be able to find out who she is. What she is. I don't know if she can be. I don't know what word to use. Dominic said, you don't need the word yet. Caleb said, no. Dominic said, come home. Home. The word landed in him, the way words land when they are new to a context. Slightly surprising, slightly too large for the space you expected them to fill, and then settling in, he said, I will. He took the train back as the sun was going down, turning the flat Midwestern sky into something extraordinary, orange and pink and the deep blue of sky that is becoming night at the edges, the colors moving and shifting the way feelings move when you are finally letting them move instead of containing them. He looked out the window for the whole 3 hours. He thought about all of it, the plastic chair, the garbage bag, the 7 homes, the sidewalk at 18, the jar under the bed, the library card he had used like a weapon, Rosie's Diner, the application at 11:16 at night, the first day at the Hargrove Grand, the corner table, the water with no ice, the conversation in the private dining room, the DNA test, the envelope on Christmas Eve, the coffee shop, Marcus appearing in the doorway, Sandra putting the card in his locker, 300 miles on a train with a photograph against his chest. He thought about Dominic's father, who had been a still man. The most powerful thing a person could do in a room was be the calmest thing in it. He thought about the woman in the apartment with the plants on the windowsill. He thought about what he wanted, not for the next week, not for the next month, but in the large sense, the full life sense, the sense that a 22-year-old man is allowed to think in when he's built something from nothing and is standing at the beginning of the next part. He wanted the degree. He wanted the work. He wanted the thing he had glimpsed in Dominic's kitchen in March. The possibility of taking what he knew and what Dominic had and doing something in the space between them that would mean something to a 4-year-old sitting on a plastic chair who did not yet know that someone was coming. He wanted the Saturday coffees. He wanted Marcus arguing about investments. He wanted the mismatched chairs. He wanted to know if the woman in the apartment could be something. Not a mother, not in the way that word usually worked, not in the way it came with history and foundation, and all the things that had not been built, but something with a name that didn't exist yet. He wanted to send Mrs. Patterson a card with his name on it. The train pulled into Union Station at 8:45. Caleb stepped onto the platform with the photograph still in his inside pocket. He walked through the station and out onto the street, and Chicago was exactly what it always was, loud and complicated and full of itself, and absolutely indifferent to any individual person's story, which was, in a strange way, one of the things he had always loved about it. He walked to the boarding house. He unlocked his room. He set down his bag. He opened the lockbox under the bed. He took out the manila envelope. He unfolded the birth certificate on the bed, the same way he had done 7 months ago, and read it the same way he always did, his name, his date of birth, the city, under father, unknown, except, not anymore. He folded it up. He put it back. He took out his phone and texted Dominic. I'm back. Thank you for today. Dominic texted back. Thank you for coming back. See you Saturday. Caleb put his phone on the small table. He made coffee on the hot plate. He sat at the window. He did not open the textbook. He just sat there, in the room that was his, in the city that was his, in a life that was his, built from nothing, from $47 in a pamphlet and a library card and a decision made on a sidewalk that he was going to survive and then more than survive. And he let it all exist at once without trying to resolve it into something simpler. He was Caleb Moore. He was 22 years old. He had a father who owned 62 floors of glass and steel and came to the coffee shop every Saturday with his phone in his pocket. He had something with Marcus that didn't have a word yet, but was getting closer to one. He had a woman in an apartment 300 miles away with plants on her windowsill and a version of his eyes and a list of things to explain that they had only just begun to go through. He had the degree he was building. He had the work he hadn't done yet that had to do with 4-year-olds on plastic chairs. He had a plan that was still being written in real time in the specific and irreplaceable language of someone who had learned to build without a blueprint. He had the photograph. He had the letter. He had the birth certificate. He had, for the first time in 22 years, more than one person who knew where he was. And the thing about that, the thing that was true and that he sat with now in the quiet of his room, while the city made its unremarkable evening sounds outside the window, was that none of it fixed the past. The plastic chair was still real. The 7 homes were still real. The garbage bag was still real. The sidewalk at 18 was still real. He would carry all of it for the rest of his life. The way you carry the things that made you, but carrying something is different when someone else knows you're carrying it. Carrying something is different when there's a Saturday morning on the other end of the week. Carrying something is different when the thing you built from nothing is starting to look like something. He drank his coffee. He breathed. He sat with the city and the quiet. He was going to be all right. He had known this since he was 18, but now he knew it was something added, not certainty, because certainty was for people who had never had the ground move, and the ground had moved under Caleb too many times for him to trust certainty. But with company. He knew it with company now. That was new. That was everything. 6 months later. The last piece of the story is small. That's intentional. Because the stories that are true, the ones that are real rather than constructed, don't end with a large gesture. They end the way they began, in the ordinary and the specific, in the details that carry the weight of all the larger things without announcing it. Caleb Moore finished his associate's degree on a Thursday in December. The ceremony was in the afternoon at the community college, in a gymnasium that smelled like every gymnasium that had ever existed, with folding chairs and a podium and a woman at the front who called names with great care and placed a diploma in each person's hands, as if it were something genuinely worth placing with care. His name was called. He walked across the stage. In the folding chairs in the 3rd row, Dominic Hargrove sat next to Marcus Hargrove, both of them in the kind of conspicuously understated attire of men who had dressed down for an occasion and were slightly too well-groomed to fully pull it off. And next to Marcus, occupying a folding chair, a particular stillness of someone who was not yet sure she had the right to be there, but had come anyway, was a woman with short silver dark hair and tired eyes that were not tired in this moment, but were something else, full of something that did not have a clean name. Caleb received his diploma. He looked out at the 3rd row. He held it up, not dramatically, not with performance, just showed it to them, the specific, uncomplicated gesture of someone showing the people who matter something that matters. Dominic was the first to stand. Marcus stood a second later, with slightly less ease, which was exactly Marcus. The woman in the folding chair stood last. She looked at him across the gymnasium. This young man she had put in a garbage bag's worth of world when he was 4 years old. This person who had built himself without her, who had survived and become and was still becoming. And she did not look away. He did not look away either. He came off the stage. He walked back toward the 3rd row. He sat down in the empty seat next to her. She said quietly, "Congratulations." He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "You invited me." He said, "I know." A pause. She said, I'm very proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but it's true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He paused. "We're going to dinner after. I'd like you to come." She said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't." She nodded. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. He looked back. Outside the gymnasium. The December afternoon was doing what December afternoons do in Chicago, going dark early, the lights of the city coming on against a sky that was cold and clear, the kind of sky that makes the city look like something out of a story, which it was, which every city is. To everyone who has ever stood on its sidewalk with $47 and a decision, inside in the folding chairs, for people who had found each other through a particular and unrepeatable series of events that constitutes a life. Not a perfect finding, not an easy finding, not a find without cost or complication or the specific, ongoing work of becoming known. Sat together in the ordinary noise of an ordinary ceremony. And that, in the end, is what all of it was for. Not the building with the name on it, not the diploma, not the DNA test or the article or the address 300 miles away or the birth certificate with the word unknown that was no longer accurate. Not even the conversation in the private dining room on a Thursday in November when a young man with dark eyes and his grandfather's hands set down a water glass and a man who'd been carrying a 22-year-old silence looked up and felt something he didn't have a word for yet. All of it was for this. For people in folding chairs in a gymnasium that smelled like every gymnasium. A diploma that was worth everything it cost. A December sky going dark outside the windows. The next chapter beginning in the specific, unremarkable, completely extraordinary way that next chapters always begin. One ordinary moment at a time. If this story moved you, if you felt something real today, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment. Tell us what moment hit you hardest. We read every single one. See you next time.